Hello and welcome back to another installment of Let's Play Europa Universalis 3. This is the Asharid Het, and cut off a little bit abruptly last time. I believe we were looking at the military map mode. Hopefully today we can finish up going over the brief overview of the interface and explaining the basic concepts of the game before we begin to actually play. A couple of comments to make on the previous video. I had said that the region map mode was exclusively for role-playing. That's actually not true. It is, pardon me. I'm having trouble finding it. Stupid me. Okay. This is actually also a chart of several formable nations. As you play various minor states within Eastern Europe even, you can form a lot of the empires described here, and there are also a list of decisions that are contingent upon your possession of that land for the most part, in many cases rather. So while this is a handy geographic reference, it's also not exclusively that, and I had said so. Also, it came to my attention, the same person who told me the current endeavor of this campaign is unrealistic watched my video and pointed out to me that the every color on the cultural map mode is actually its own family of cultures. I had said that Portuguese was part of the Iberian culture group. While that makes sense, it actually isn't for whatever reason. Every color is its own distinct family. So while I was right to point out that Neapolitan here along the Aragonese land coastline is not part of the same cultural group as Iberian, that's also true of Portuguese. That could be for game balancing reasons, I'm not sure, but for whatever reason I had said that in the previous video and was actually wrong about that. So, going back to where we were, I believe we're at the military tab. Now, this is an important reference for a number of reasons. It details, first of all, the category of unit that you use. In this game, there are 3 slots for land units. There's an infantry unit, a cavalry unit, and an artillery unit. And at this point in the 14th century, artillery does not exist as a technology yet, or at least as a military unit that you can construct. It would have been pretty much exclusively for sieges and naval warfare. But as a land unit, it doesn't exist yet, so it's grayed out here. You select the respective unit you want for each category here, but since this is the very early game, there's only one option available in each slot. In Western Europe, I believe there's actually 2. For cavalry, you can choose Latin Knights, and I believe there's another option as well. Here we really only have this Drazinia cavalry and this Bardish infantry. As land technology is researched, more units will become available over time, and as the game progresses, their relative strengths and weaknesses will actually diverge. You can choose units based upon the particular strengths you want to emphasize. Sometimes that has a significant bearing on the geography that you're fighting in. Defensive units probably would do better in densely forested or mountainous terrain if you are going to fight a defensive war, and also relative to the unit type chosen by your opponent. Combat doesn't quite work where if you're attacking, your offense is what's counted. It actually occurs in phases, but we will describe that in a moment. So, in addition to these units, and you can see their values detailed here, you have the category of ship as well. That is once again irrelevant for us because we're landlocked, and actually just the ships are just objectively better as time goes on, so as more advanced designs are researched, they'll simply show up here. But until we have access to the sea, this is a moot point for us. War exhaustion is a very important metric. It's a self-explanatory thing in as much as it's a concept. As your men die in battle, as your provinces are occupied, as you lose battles, you accrue war exhaustion, which is sort of a cumulative measure of your people's fatigue and disgust with war. As it increases, stability cost increases, taxation is reduced, revolt risk increases, and this is capped by a limit which is mostly a function of your ruler's administrative skill. Additionally, you can hire advisors that, not advisors, you can, your degree of decentralization as a government is actually probably the greatest factor of this. The more decentralized you are, the lower your war exhaustion is capped. It occurs many times in this game where you are involved in long, drawn-out conflicts that go on for so long that your war exhaustion is actually full or nearly full. The lower that limit is, the worse your penalty is going to be maxed out at. So this is a very important thing to keep an eye on. Most of your time in this game will be spent at war, so the lower this value can stay, the better. Furthermore, you have morale, which is really, in a literal sense, morale would denote enthusiasm to fight, eagerness, patriotism, these sorts of things amalgamated into the psychological will of your forces. But it's also, in game terms, sort of a calculus of things like supply and logistics and organization, and as well as the aforementioned psychological factors. Early in the game, it's quite low, and as with just about everything else, it's contingent upon a number of factors. As you can see in the breakdown here in this tooltip, our morale for our land units is 3.2. 0.4 of that comes from our ruler's military skill, and as I said in the previous video, every ruler will have its own set of administrative, diplomatic, and military skills that get assigned immediately when they are born, and actually they are immutable. They can't increase or decrease, but they affect just about everything in the game. Being Catholic gives us a tiny little boost of 0.05. Our value of aristocracy gives us 0.4. I'll detail that in a moment. Whereas our governmental posture of free subjects versus serfdom reduces that. Likewise, land, and all of these are sort of a national policy position that I will detail momentarily. Our land maintenance is at full, and this is actually the greatest variable factor of morale. In most cases, especially as you become a larger, more powerful nation, it doesn't make a lot of sense to fully fund your armies in peacetime, but doing so maximizes the amount of morale that they can fight with. Over the course of the game, and then prestige, we have a slightly negative prestige, so that reduces it. Over the course of the game, eventually your land technology will directly increase this morale, and that becomes probably the greatest factor as time moves along. Again, I think this is because morale is representative of more than simply the psychological will to fight, but rather the logistical arm of your military machine, which in late medieval times would have been quite rudimentary, but by the Napoleonic era you have formal systems of supply and organization, etc. And that is what morale models. You also have a support limit, and this is perhaps just as important as morale. This is the number of units that your realm or your country can realistically field as a standing army. There are different statistics you can emphasize to increase this. Generally, there is a tension between the size of your army and the quality of your army, and you can lean in either direction, but beyond that, for the most part, it's a function of the amount of land you control and also the quality of that land. Force limit is a function of base tax, which I will explain in a moment, but every province has a base tax level, which, if there's any one individual factor that describes the basic wealth of the province, it's that base tax, which naturally is representative of the degree of latent wealth that you can draw from that land as its ruler. So, if you control land with really low base tax, it confers fewer men to your total standing army that you can support, naturally, because you have to pay them. Also, the manpower of each province is another factor, which is individual. That's mostly based on population, but it's also relevant to this total pool that we can support. We, as tiny Mazovia, even though our land is relatively high quality for this region, base tax of 6 and a base tax of 10, we only have 2 provinces, so our limit of 6 is respectable for a country with 2 provinces, but is quite underwhelming by all other standards. Okay, the religion menu. Of course, we're Catholic. As the Reformation unfolds later in the game, that's not something you can necessarily take for granted as someone playing in Europe west of the Balkans. But additionally, you have a tolerance value. This is highly important and has bearing on a lot of what I said last time. You have a tolerance of the true faith, which is, of course, your own religion. Everyone else is wrong, and you believe in God the proper way. There's a tolerance of heretics, which would be subdivisions within the same religion. And then there's a tolerance of heathens. And if we go back to the religious map mode, pretty much everyone is Catholic. If you control a province with a heresy, that would be the applicable value would be the tolerance for heretics. If we controlled Russian land, which as Mazovia is not totally unrealistic, assuming we don't die in fairly short order, the value that would apply would be the tolerance for heretics, because Orthodox Christians are still Christians, albeit from the vantage of Catholics, mistaken heretical ones. Likewise, during the Reformation era, if we were to control land that was Reformed or Lutheran as a Catholic, we would regard them as heretics, likewise. If we were to control this province here, Bresti, which is Baltic Pagan, as we detailed before, that is heathen. So we would actually incur a penalty of -2. And also within the Muslim world, Sunni and Shia are heretics to one another. So land changes hand quite a bit in this region, and those same metrics apply there as well. Now, these values, you would think that tolerance of your own faith would be irrelevant, sans any penalty that would apply. But actually, this is a direct modifier on population growth. We could see that our tolerance of 4 gives us a 2% population increase. It also reduces our stability cost, etc. So increasing your tolerance is sort of a measure of your own religious solidarity. And over the grand scope of the game, that can eventually become very meaningful. If your population grows significantly greater than another country's, your manpower pool will be greater, your taxes will be greater. It does add up over time. And likewise, we have a tolerance of 0 for heretics, so we would simply lose all of that bonus if we controlled Orthodox or Reformed land, for instance. So we would lose the bonus. In economic terms, that's a loss. In accounting terms, it's equivalent. And we would incur a penalty if we controlled heathen land. These values are mostly a function of what we'll get into just now. Your value of innovative versus narrow-minded as a domestic policy. The more innovative you are, the more secular you are, cheaper your technology is, but the lower your tolerance of the true faith is. If you're narrow-minded, you increase You know what? Actually, in this mod, it doesn't work that way. They changed that. You simply get a missionary bonus. Okay, well, I am actually wrong about that. But there are ways you can increase or decrease your own tolerance of your true faith. And they have bearing on the points just now described. This tab, your government tab, the most important factor is your own nation's stamp on a measure of domestic policies. Depending upon your government type, and we are a feudal duchy, there is a duration of time that must elapse before you can change a domestic policy, and you simply move it by one tick in either direction, and you get to choose which one you want to change. This is supposed to represent the glacial drift towards a modern state that occurred during this time period. In 1356, we are still very much in the Middle Ages, and that's reflected by, our highly decentralized enfeoffed manorial system. This is hardly any more centralized than the minimum value. We're fully aristocratic, we're highly serf-oriented. However, this is unusual, being somewhat innovative as opposed to narrow-minded. Most nations will start on the right half of this fence. All of these have, just about all of them have penalties and bonuses reflective of the tension between various schools of thought on different areas of policy. And I won't go into all of these. I'll kind of hover over these tooltips, so if you want to pause and read them, you can, but at some point, description is a little bit redundant. Here we go. Secularism Theocracy. That's what I was looking for. Here, if we go to secularism, we can increase our tolerance for heathens and heretics. And if we move towards theocracy, we can increase our tolerance of the true faith. That's how this mod changed that. That's right. Secondarily, in this view, we have a chart of national ideas. These are powerful bonuses that you, over the course of the game, get to apply to your nation. These gray boxes are slots that aren't unlocked yet. You unlock these as you research governmental technology. And as I said before, technology is basically the amount of wealth you can throw at the stability cost of your country. As you gain provinces, you gain wealth, but as you gain provinces, you gain stability cost, and that is a mirror of the technology cost as well, which you get to choose how you want to allocate. As you research government techs, you unlock these ideas, which, somewhat like the slider options, are in many ways mutually exclusive. They have certain requirements, and sometimes they have penalties for alternative schools of thought. For instance, if we adopt Bill of Rights, which admittedly doesn't come until towards the end of the game, the egalitarian protection of the rights of every subject is somewhat at odds with the aristocratic tradition of knights and a landed gentry, which would have supplied the cavalry of a medieval state. So cavalry becomes more expensive. So too, pompous diplomats from the same demographic are going to be harder to come by. That's not an excellent example because diplomats generally accumulate faster than you can use them anyway, but just to illustrate the point of, you kind of have to specialize over time, and there are trade-offs with most of the decisions you make. We start here with merchant adventures. I'm a fan of this idea personally, but it depends on your play style. And in our case, this will reduce our production efficiency, increase our production cost, and that's for the technology. But it gives us more merchants, reduces the cost of sending them, and it gives them a better fighting chance once they arrive at the center of trade. Then we have a leader tab. This is fairly simple. You accumulate diplomats, as I just said, and then you can actually spend them to hire generals or admirals. Your experiences in battle will increase a respective value of tradition for Army and Navy. Losing a battle actually gives you more tradition than winning. The lessons of defeat are often more strongly learned and felt, and that will actually atrophy over time as the freshness of the experience in the minds of your people fades. And you can hire them, and based upon the value that you have for Army or naval tradition, the higher quality you would receive in that event. Discipline is literally a direct modifier on the actual effectiveness of your fighting. Undisciplined units will fight poorer, more disciplined units will fight better. The base value is 100, so we are slightly above that, and we can see the breakdown of why. There's a 10% reduction by default, but our ruler's military skill and also the modifier we have as a tough soldier improve that to 103%. So effectively what that means is our units will fight with a 3% bonus. Culture, much like the Army and Navy tradition, in periods of peace, culture tends to receive enough attention to flourish, and you can implement these various domestic decisions to increase cultural tradition over time. The higher that is, the higher quality advisor you have a chance of getting when you recruit them, and as we discussed previously, advisors provide you with specialized effects. When you hire them, as with generals and admirals, it will immediately reduce that pool of tradition, and while you're at war, that will reduce much faster. So if you're in sort of a spell of peace, sometimes it makes the most sense to try to improve your cultural tradition and hire a good advisor. This part of the game is probably the most detached from the rest of it. The Statecraft ties together the military, economic, diplomatic, political, and all of these factors pretty organically, but this cultural aspect does feel a little bit detached. It's generally useful, though, when you have enough time to catch your breath to try to recruit a great man for your court that will confer a desirable effect to your nation. And then finally, we have missions and decisions. As with the region map mode, generally you'll have the option to form some kind of long gone great state that used to exist in the region where your country is situated. We actually don't have that right now. I think its visibility might also be contingent upon some other factors, but we can, for instance, if you satisfy these requirements detailed by the asterisks, pass a liquor act if we have 2 magistrates, if we are more narrow-minded than innovative, which is not true of us, and if our ruler has an administrative skill of at least 6, or if we have a treasurer advisor or collector advisor, we could pass a decision which, for the rest of the game, would increase our taxes by 3%, but also increase our stability cost by 4. And so, true with many things in this game, it's a trade-off. And it's one of hundreds and hundreds of dynamic factors mutually at play with one another that you have to read and evaluate when making your decisions as the player. So it also details our mission, which we have the mission to improve our prestige. If we have a prestige of 10, then we'll gain 10 more. And then once you satisfy a mission, it will generate a new mission. Generally in the early game, these missions are important because they give you a casus belli, which is a right to declare war. Sometimes, they're trifling, somewhat blow-off missions, gain 10 prestige, whatever. You'll do something like, let's see here. Yeah, if we arrange a festival, there's a 45% chance that we'll gain 5 prestige, but it's kind of expensive, so you can chase fulfilling these missions to see if you can get a new one, which will give you the advantage of a casus belli. In our case, as a vassal, we actually can't declare war because we're not politically sovereign, but just to give you an example of how that usually works. Okay, so looking at the top bar here, we have that manpower pool that I had mentioned yesterday. There's a maximum threshold. Every province generates young men every month that will fight for your land. And so we have a reinforced rate of 319, a maximum of 7,672, and a current value of basically 5,000. So you can see detailed in the tooltip what applies to that. That's fairly self-explanatory otherwise. Stability is a hugely important concept. It affects directly or indirectly just about everything in the game. It's on a value of -3 to +3, and as I had said with stability cost, the sum of all the factors that apply to stability cost are added to a pool. Every province you own adds to that pool, but it also generates wealth that you can spend towards improving your stability. And having a positive stability gives you bonuses of solidarity, and negative stability, for instance, if our stability was -2 rather than +2, you would have the opposite of all of these values. Taking certain decisions, declaring war without a right to do so, certain events, these things will all reduce stability, and in many cases you're faced with the decision of reducing your stability for something you want, or to avoid something you don't want, you'll have to take a stability hit. These decisions have to be weighed very carefully because, especially later in the game, as time progresses, stability cost becomes very high, and it can take several years to repair a tranquil, stable, peaceful situation. This is your treasury, which is of course just the sum of the store of all your immediate money. That is reduced every month, and then you receive a census tax. The economic model for this game is interesting. Outside of extraordinary factors like having a master of mint or a national bank, which is an idea that you can pass, it assumes that you're not going to retain income for your treasury. Doing so will generate inflation, which causes everything to increase in price. The normal model assumes that you live off of your census tax, which is collected at the end of every year, with all monthly expenses going towards either stability or respective categories of technology. As your bureaucracy improves, you can afford to siphon off monthly income to your treasury, and you will not incur inflation to the extent that that's true. We have no institutions that reduce inflation, so we actually increase our inflation by default, unfortunately. There's no sense in making that worse if we can help it, so we should probably leave that at 0 and devote all of our money towards stability. As you can see, the sum of our taxation, production, trade, as I had described previously, goes towards that monthly income. But the treasury here at the top is the sum total of our liquid assets, and then it gives you a quick glance of what your monthly expenditure and your yearly census tax are. Prestige is also a very important metric. This actually gravitates towards an equilibrium. By default, it's 0, but you can do some things which improve or reduce that. Prestige, much like stability, will affect most or many factors of the game, usually diplomatic ones. As it says here in the tooltip, prestige affects many things, but primarily how likely other nations are to accept our proposals, how far we can extend our sphere of influence, and how likely it is that our royal marriages will result in personal unions. So whenever you make a diplomatic offer to a nation, their likelihood of accepting is in part a measure of your prestige. If you have a royal marriage with them and their king dies, the likelihood that your king will become the ruler of their realm is higher. The morale of your armies will be higher, as you can see detailed here. And also you spend prestige to expand your sphere of influence. So it's not to be ignored, but it also is fairly fluid. You can have high prestige. If you lose a few battles and 10 years pass, it will reduce significantly. People's memories are short, so while it's an important measure, it usually is not very static either. Infamy is very important. This is, of course, how notoriously bad you are. If you conquer land that you don't have a legitimate right to, you declare wars you don't have a right to declare, or if you pass certain decisions that are seen as tyrannical, your infamy will increase. This has an opposite effect with prestige towards other nations' likelihood to accept your proposals, and also will reduce every nation in the world's opinion of you to the extent that you have infamy. The most important thing to consider with infamy, though, is the limit. I'm playing on the normal difficulty. If you play on the very hard difficulty, the infamy limit is a lot lower. For all intents and purposes, you cannot go over the infamy. If you do so, the entire world will dogpile you, you'll get terrible events, you will not last long if you do that. So you have an infamy reduction, which is a function of your ruler's diplomatic skill, among other things, but the most important metric here is simply don't go over the limit. Legitimacy, if you're playing as a monarchy, and there are other government types, there are hordes, there are merchant republics, there are administrative republics, there are theocracies, etc. This only applies to monarchies, but it's basically a measure of how rightful your dynasty is considered to rule. And doing things like claiming thrones or having low prestige reduces this. And like stability and prestige, it also affects a number of things, as you can see here, most significantly your tolerance. If you have low legitimacy, signing royal marriages will increase that, but the catch-22 is having low legitimacy with royal marriages increases the liability of you being on the short end of the stick with personal unions, inheritance, etc. You have a myriad of advisors, merchants, colonists, diplomats, missionaries, spies, and magistrates. Very quickly, merchants we already described. You send them into centers of trade. They compete with other merchants. If they successfully compete another merchant away, it is deleted, and you siphon off a market share which goes back to your national coffers. Colonists, you send them on missions to attempt to colonize land. They can succeed or fail. Diplomats are spent with every single mission you or diplomatic inquiry you make. If we wanted to request military access from Bohemia, we would spend a diplomat to do so. Missionaries, send them on missions to convert land that's not of the true faith. Spies, we don't have any, so we can't, but if we did, we could click on this menu and there would be a list of espionage missions we could send them on. And magistrates are primarily used to construct buildings, in addition to the actual monetary cost of doing so.